Okay, so I'm going to show about a 20-minute clip from a very fine documentary that came out in 1970 called King, a filmed record from Montgomery to Memphis, which covers the 13 years of King's activism from 55 to 1968 and his assassination 50 years ago. I had watched this documentary before, but it finally stood out to me when I showed it in class this last week, how much of a focus there is on freedom. People think of King correctly as a civil rights leader, but he was so much more than that. Throughout his life, he thought of himself as the leader of a freedom movement for political, social, economic freedom. Right? And that's how we should think about him philosophically. And I think it's unfortunate that so many people in my generation don't seem to remember the King that I remember. I lived through this period. And so it's important to pass on to this generation some of the ideas in as unfiltered a way as possible, what King actually thought, what he represented, what the movement was like. And this documentary excerpt that I'm going to show you focuses on the Birmingham campaign, desegregation campaign of the spring and summer of 1963, 55 years ago. The reason for that is King's letter that many people read, called the Letter from Birmingham Jail, was an account of his perspective and his experience in solitary confinement. It was eventually published in a book that I highly recommend that people don't read anymore, but I finally, over the weekend, read cover to cover for the first time in maybe ever, called Why We Can't Wait. It is an absolutely fantastic account of what I would say is the situation of freedom in the United States in 1963. And if we could do something like that for 2018, if we had somebody at the leadership of a movement who was putting into his thoughts what the constellation of forces are that characterize freedom in our country in 2018, that would be a very useful book to publish. So at the end of class, before you take off, I have some extra copies of books, 2 copies of Why We Can't Wait, one of the last book that King published called Where Do We Go From Here, and also a copy To the Promised Land, Martin Luther King and the Fight for Economic Justice by Michael Honey. He's going to be speaking at the end of January. He teaches at University of Washington, Tacoma. We've invited him to give a seminar for philosophy students and history students and economics students, and also to give a public talk. That's a Thursday, January 24th, that Michael Honey will be here, and I'm sure we'll have Sarah asked to videotape that much more impressive presentation. He is one of the leading scholars on King, and he focused especially on the last couple of years of King's life, when King was really drawing front and center his opposition to the war in Vietnam and connecting civil rights with economic justice. That's the King that so many in my generation seem, however, conveniently to have forgotten about. So let's watch the 20 minutes from King, a filmed record, Montgomery to Memphis, which is an interesting documentary because it has no narration. It's not like one of the Talking Heads, Ken Burns, PBS documentaries. It places a greater demand on the viewer to follow what's going on without any narration. It's composed 100% of newsreel footage, and I'm focusing just on the 20 minutes or so that cover the Birmingham freedom movement of spring, summer 1963. So Tim, if you could get the lights. I'm streaming this from Amazon Prime. Get the lights. Did everybody get a copy of these excerpts from King's Where Do We Go? Why We Can't Wait? Okay, before we get into the handout, and I present some of my ideas on King's philosophical, theological, political view of freedom, Any reactions to this? It's a different sort of documentary than you normally see these days. I think largely due to Ken Burns' Civil War documentary in the 80s, was it, Walter? You get the talking heads. Early 90s. Yeah, you get a narration, you get talking heads, experts. This is unfiltered newsreel footage, which is more demanding on the audience, but it puts you into the situation far more dramatically than having somebody tell you. You feel it. And especially the use of freedom songs, which King talks about. There's an excerpt I want to point out as a way of galvanizing the movement. Yeah.
That letter from a Birmingham jail, he wrote that on the edges of newspapers, and were given to him by the black trustees of the jail. Right. And my understanding was he was able to recite passages of these philosophers, because they only showed a part, they only had a part of it, but it was a long document. And he was able to cite Jewish philosopher Martin Buber's sayings, and other philosophers, St. Thomas Aquinas, from memory, as opposed to having his library. He was in jail, and this was a very smart man.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of an exaggeration to say he was citing all of them from memory alone. He did smuggle out initial responses to an open letter that 8 clergy in Alabama, moderate or to progressive clergy, who agreed with the goals of desegregation. They disagreed with the method, and especially this campaign in Birmingham of nonviolent civil disobedience or direct action. So King did, when he got that letter in jail that was smuggled in by one of the black staff in the jail, he wrote in the margins and so forth. But after he was out, he edited and put together the entire letter, which is about 20 pages. And then in '64, it's published as Chapter 5 in a slightly revised version in this book, Why We Can't Wait. So he certainly had the ability to name a lot of different influences, whether it's Thomas Aquinas or Paul Tillich, the great 20th century German theologian. Socrates is mentioned. He's name-checking all the influences on him, but that letter is also trying to respond to the open letter by these clergy who he thought simply didn't understand the point of the demonstrations, who had accused King and the leadership of doing something that was unwise and untimely. And King is basically, it's a deeply ironic letter. He's throwing back to them, gee, I'm sorry I'm wasting your precious time because you're in your fancy religious institutions. I'm in solitary confinement, and you can't agree with the goal without sharing with me the responsibility to take some risks. So it's a deeply angry letter in many respects. If you read it aloud, you can detect the irony that's just below the surface. And he's speaking to fellow clergy. You should understand, don't sit on the fence. The opponent is primarily white moderates who in theory say they support something but are unwilling to take responsibility to do something in support of the cause. It's a beautiful letter. It's taught in English classes. I teach it in philosophy classes. It's probably one of King's most succinct, best-known works, but it's part of a much larger work, which is even more amazing, because this gives you the lay of the land in 1963, where freedom is at. It's a philosophical, political, economic, religious, cultural sense of what were the conditions, what was the situation of freedom in the United States in 1963. And I can't think of any other work that better grasps that, what we could call in philosophy, a totality of what's happening in our country at that particular moment. So what I decided to do, because I'm teaching King in my classes, was I'm going to use a digitized version and just go through every reference to freedom, right? Because this was a freedom movement. Civil rights, yes, but it's economic rights. King is absolutely clear from the beginning in his life, civil rights and economic rights are very deeply connected. He adds the Vietnam War and militarism by the end of the 60s, although he's also addressing it in this book. He discusses the plight of Native Americans in a couple of very moving pages in this book that I would, if I'd had space, I would have extracted. This is well before the American Indian movement really took off in the late 60s, early 70s. And he's saying the United States was founded on the dispossession of the indigenous peoples and on slavery. Right? So it's very clear that there is a kind of oppressive unfreedom that is at the very founding of the United States.
He was also involved with, you may have mentioned it, with the anti-Vietnam movement too.
Yeah.
Because of the disproportionate number of African Americans sent, and other reasons too, not just that, philosophical reasons, but
Yeah.
one of them was the fact that there was a disproportionate number of African Americans sent to fight in what was known as a poor man's fight and a rich man's war.
Right, right, absolutely. And that's a key theme in this book, which was published in 1967, the last book that King wrote, called Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? So this especially forefronts after the successes of the early to mid-60s on the civil rights front with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65, King starts looking at conditions of poverty and urban blight and issues of fair housing, the growing gulf between rich and poor. He's organizing a Poor People's Campaign, which would have led in 1968 in his original plan to massive civil disobedience at Congress. He didn't live to see that, but he was also speaking out against the Vietnam War in this period. So you're absolutely right. It's war or militarism, civil rights or racism, and economic injustice or poverty are part of what he called the great triplet of evil in the United States. And I leave you to judge whether those are still relevant in 2018. But I'm more interested just in what are the philosophical influences on King's conception of freedom. So we'll get to that in a little bit, but other comments?
I found it interesting how in the beginning it said, "No man is free if he fears death."
Yeah.
That really resonated with me. I spent some time in India, and I did a lot of silence programs, a lot of meditation, where, the thought of, I'm not this body, I'm not this mind. This whole concept of freedom, in a sense, is very, spiritual. So I feel like Martin Luther King, he really much touches upon that. And even Gandhi's movement, non-violent demonstrations in a sense, also resonated with me with that saying, no man is free if he fears death.
Right. One of the key figures for King, as we know, was Mahatma Gandhi. And so there are many different sources. What's an unexpected source for many people is the existentialist influence on King. So we'll get to that in a second as well. There are 20th century philosophers like Martin Buber, like Paul Tillich, and then he indicates even people like Martin Heidegger, Jean-Paul Sartre, whose understanding of freedom focuses on how we face death and how the meaning of our lives is measured in terms of whether we have a project that shapes our commitments, and that we can face death in a serious way, so not be overly anxious or fearful in the face of our death or mortality. So we'll get to that again, but I think the religious dimension is very important. King's influence by Gandhi was very important. Other quick responses just to the video, though. Yeah.
As an immigrant and a person of color, I just realized how much we owe from Martin Luther King. Because without that movement, I'm sure I will not be experiencing this freedom right now that I'm exercising.
Right, right. So one of the things that interests me, obviously in 2018, is that a lot of people of my generation either have forgotten the impact of that movement or seem demoralized for one reason or another. And so there's a need, I think, to reclaim that connection to King as a leader, but also the idea of movements that put forward leaders like King. King certainly didn't expect when he got out of graduate school to become the leader of a social movement, but indeed he was thrust into that position, partly because of his excellent writing and speaking skills. So that's an important issue, I think, and why we should think of King as measuring where we are in 2018 as compared to 50, 55 years ago in this case. Let me just highlight a couple of points here, and we'll see where the discussion goes. King says, this is in the second column on the first page, that an important part of these mass meetings, usually in churches, because those are the only places where such meetings could be held, was the freedom songs. He says that freedom songs are the soul of the movement. Now, I'm not sure what the freedom songs are of 2018, but King is realizing that emotion, that the heart plays a very significant role in galvanizing people, bringing them together, giving them a sense of commitment and a willingness to face real threats of physical violence directed against them. So it's key. King says that these adaptations of songs the slaves sang, the sorrow songs, the songs for joy, the battle hymns, and the anthems of our movement. And we heard some of those. And the kind of fervor, the contagious enthusiasm of people who are willing to do amazing things. Music, song can play in a very significant way to move things forward. Thoughts about that? Is that still true in 2018? That music plays that kind of role? Not a performer on a stage or a song that you download or stream. This is an engagement of a group in this enthusiastic recognition of one's power, one's ability to change things, to face genuine risks and dangers. Does music still play that role?
I know now all these the ones that are movements that are covered, protests that are covered usually end in violence. The message of nonviolence by Martin Luther King has been lost.
Yeah. Well, I saw just recently Taylor Swift endorsed a couple of candidates, and then there was a furor whether musicians, singers should make endorsements. That's not what is going on here. This is a very different sense, not of a musician or a performer endorsing a candidate for office. Whether that's appropriate or not, that's a different discussion, whether that surprises people who were fans of the music but didn't realize the political perspective of the performer. This is music as an expression of this collective willingness to work together to achieve some very important objectives, which is desegregation in Birmingham or whatever the contemporary equivalent might be.
Well, we still have it, but it's just limited to, 148 characters on Twitter. I got
Okay. The tweets of the movement. It's hard to sing a tweet, though. Well, I just raised that as an important issue. One thing that for King is very clear, that freedom is innate. It's hardwired, we might say. It's you find it even in children. And if you noticed, who actually won the victory in Birmingham were who? King had gotten arrested. He was in solitary confinement. He wrote a letter. Other leaders had been arrested, largely symbolic arrests. And then students protested. There were walkouts in the schools in Birmingham, and literally the jails were flooded with thousands and thousands of students, upon whom fire hoses and attack dogs were used. Of course, if Eugene Bull Connor, who we saw here, who was the Commissioner of Public Safety or the equivalent of a police chief, if he had had his way, he would have used much more modern technology in a contemporary protest. But what he used shocked the nation, and I don't know if it would shock the nation today. If it does on TV, this dramatization of violence directed against nonviolent demonstrators, would that shock the nation to see people have fire hoses or attack dogs used against them? That's an open question. But on the second page, I wanted to draw your attention to something that really I found deeply moving about the children. Towards the bottom of the second-hand second column. He says, the children themselves had the answer to the misguided sympathies of the press. One of the most ringing replies came from a child of no more than 8 who walked with her mother one day in a demonstration. An amused policeman leaned down to her and said with mock roughness, "What do you want?" The child looked into his eyes, unafraid, and gave her answer. "Freedom," she said. She could not even pronounce the word, but no Gabriel trumpet could have sounded a truer note. So even an 8-year-old better understands freedom than the police officer who is making light of her involvement in the demonstration. Freedom for King is in our very nature as human beings. He also insists it can't be granted to us, it can't be voluntarily given to us by those in power. It has to be demanded by those who experience a lack of freedom. The very bottom of the page on the second column, first page, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Who's he quoting, essentially? He's taking lines from a 19th century thinker activist. Anybody know?
Was it Booker T. Washington?
No.
W. Du Bois?
No.
Douglas?
Frederick Douglass, yeah. This is from his speech on independence in the West Indies, I believe. So King does that. I mean, he's not footnoting, which sometimes people criticize King for name dropping, not footnoting, but he's not writing scholarly works with elaborate apparatuses and citations. But his point is, freedom is something that has to be demanded. Movements for social change come from below. They don't come from the top down. So they're about what we could call, using a fancy term, self-emancipation, not a gesture of kindness from people in power. Right? People assert themselves. They make a demand. They have to organize themselves. There's no guarantee that they will, in fact, be successful. The top of the page on the right-hand column, he says, history doesn't pose problems without eventually producing solutions. The disenchanted, the disadvantaged, and the disinherited seem at times of deep crisis to summon up some sort of genius that enables them to perceive and capture the appropriate weapons to carve out their destiny. He then goes on to say, a few pages later, there is no tactical theory so neat that a revolutionary struggle for a share of power can be won merely by pressing a row of buttons. There's no app for that. There's an app for that? No, not for freedom, not for freedom struggles. Okay. Human beings, with all their faults and strengths, constitute the mechanism of a social movement. They must make mistakes and learn from them, make more mistakes and learn anew. They must taste defeat as well as success and discover how to live with each. Time and action are the teachers. There's just lines after lines, passages after passages in all of King's writings, but especially in this book, Why We Can't Wait, that stress the self-creativity of social movements. You have no guarantee of success. You don't necessarily even know exactly where you're headed. There are ups and downs, successes and failures, and you keep moving forward. Let me point out another line that stood out. I'd forgotten. Here we are in 2018 in a college campus. King writes, second page, top of the column, to a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. So we wonder where academic freedom comes from. It does come from a distinctive history in the United States in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. We don't need to get into those details, but he's saying this idea of speaking truth and engaging in principled debate and disagreement in modern universities, colleges, universities, we can trace that back to Socrates, which I had skipped over that line many times, but these days, the idea of free speech on campuses, whether by professors or students, that's has reemerged as a issue subject to debate and discussion. And then the final point I want to make, and see what other things you have to say. There's a kind of confidence in this letter that even if the white moderates don't support the movement, now he's trying to win them over, but even if they don't, he says, and this is in the middle of the second page, like the second column, we will reach the goal of freedom in Birmingham and all over the nation because the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up with America's destiny. We will win our freedom because the sacred heritage of our nation and the eternal will of God are embodied in our echoing demands. There's something very refreshing, and perhaps people would disagree with this. Is the goal of our country freedom? Has it been the goal of the United States? King is speaking in a certain kind of language of patriotism. He's also speaking as a preacher, as a theologian, saying that there's an overlap between the sacred destiny of the country, what we would call a kind of a civil religious argument, and his own particular religious commitment that he names as the eternal will of God. Do people in 2018 have the confidence that the goal of the United States is freedom? And if so, why? If not, why not?
Freedom from what?
Well,
There's so many different kinds of freedom.
yeah. Well, freedom from fear, the sort you're talking about. Franklin Roosevelt gave a famous speech towards the end of his administration, I think it was in 1944, on the 4 freedoms, and one of those freedoms was freedom from fear, another is freedom from want, from economic difficulties. As FDR said in that speech, if I remember correctly, necessitous men are not free men. So people who don't have their basic needs satisfied are going to be stressed out, they're going to be anxious, are not going to be able to accomplish anything that they would like within the full range of political and other freedoms. So economic freedom becomes a significant feature for King. So freedom from want, freedom from deprivation. King supported universal health care. King supported a living wage, even a basic wage that would not be connected to whether you're employed or not. These were fairly significant demands in the late 60s when King was putting them forward. I suspect there's still demands today. The March on Washington in '63 was a march for jobs and justice, right? And one of those demands, if you look at the demands around the March on Washington in August 1963, was to raise the minimum wage to a living wage. So this side of King is the one I highly encourage you to explore, and we will, with Michael Honey, making another pitch for this next January 24th. The history department, the economics department, and the philosophy department are coordinating to try to get students to come here. Michael Honey do a seminar just with students, and then another session where we have the whole campus. And he is definitely one of the leading scholars who looks at King as a civil rights leader, as an anti-war activist, as a labor leader, because King was killed in the context of supporting the sanitation worker strike in Memphis, Tennessee in the spring of 1968. So he's a freedom leader, I guess we would want to say, if we put all those different factors together.
He was also, my understanding, very supportive of labor union organizations, very supportive of labor.
Yeah.
Because that was part of the whole struggle. It's not just the Black Civil Rights Movement. He was reaching beyond the Black Civil Rights Movement into the labor movement and the struggle for employment rights.
Right. One of the things, Birmingham is interesting because Birmingham was an industrial base in the Deep South, and there had been efforts to organize the steel factories in Birmingham in the 1940s. It was called Operation Dixie, and it was largely unsuccessful because labor didn't really I think King's view is they didn't significantly enough address the issue of racism. And so much of this book is both sympathetic to organized labor, but also critical. You've got to address issues of race. So class and race interconnect. What King doesn't talk about, that we would perhaps need to talk about as well, is issues of gender and sexual orientation. King, for him, that was not an issue front and center, but clearly it is today. And so I'm not trying to make the case that King's approach to freedom solves all of our contemporary problems, but it can be an inspiration for us to try to do for 2018 to engage in that kind of philosophical, political analysis of, what's our situation? Labor is certainly at the forefront. Race is at the forefront with Black Lives Matter, for example. We've got immigration as an issue. We've got the Me Too movement as an issue. So the question is how you bring all this together into a new movement for freedom. But what would freedom look like? That's the key issue. What do we want the future of our country and world to look like? That's an element of creativity on the part, especially of young people, the millennials, and some of the older generation people, baby boomers.
So,
Yeah, oh, go ahead, then Walter.
So yeah, I do feel like we're still fighting for freedom. And I feel like it's a never ending. I feel like fighting for freedom, even if we do achieve all the struggles that we're doing now, we're still going to keep fighting for the next freedom, for maybe our inner freedom or however, but I think it's a never ending a struggle for freedom. It's always going to be there for us, and we always have to be participating in it.
Right, I think King agrees with that. Freedom, he would say, is finite, it's situated, it's very much dependent on the historical context. So what freedom means today is different than freedom meant back then. So it's the same concept, but how it applies to our issues is both in continuity, but still inflected and somewhat different today than it was back then. So it's an ongoing struggle, ongoing process.
Yeah. Is it fair? I mean, like, will there ever be, there will just be a constant struggle with freedom?
Yeah, although if we were to add to the mix of all the things I mentioned, the challenge of climate change, there is an urgency, just recent report a couple of days ago. We have maybe a decade or so to get things rolling towards a carbon neutral or post-carbon era, or we are going to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius and potentially a point of no return in terms of the global Earth's temperature. And what would that mean? That would mean extreme weather events on a regular basis. That would mean the spread of infectious diseases from tropical to more temperate regions. Notice the mosquitoes plaguing us in Southern California. Those are not indigenous to Southern California. They have migrated. Those little black annoying insects, mosquitoes that... so the climate change, King wasn't addressing that problem. That is a contemporary problem.
Right.
And that requires a just solution. So freedom from environmental devastation, we would want to add to this mix.
I think, I don't know if it can be called an organized movement in the broad sense, although I think that there are tendencies and organizations that maybe approach this issue of freedom differently. But say, for example, the movement towards the freedom of non-human living things, which is related to the environment, but to other animals. I see more interest in veganism. Of course, that's regional, I think, but I certainly see it more in this part of the United States, perhaps than in other parts. So I would look at animal rights as another issue of freedom, not necessarily for humanity, but for other beings. But also maybe it's a kind of freedom for humanity as well. A freedom to accept that something else also has rights, to not suffer abuse, to not be exploited.
Yeah.
And I think all these things are always related to other factors, economics, values, traditions, perhaps some traditions need to be broken.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that would be interesting, that enlargement of freedom beyond the human realm or even the global human realm. King was definitely not a vegan, and he liked Southern cooking. If you read biographies of King, I mean, he enjoyed a good meal. So with animal products. But that's not the issue. What King as an individual may have been like or preferred, and he is not a saint or a martyr. He's a flesh and blood human being who had ideas and has a legacy. And so the question is, can we enlarge that legacy? How do we do it in 2018? That's an open question for my generation, for your generation, and we need some philosophical, political, theological, cultural collaboration. Anything else? Who hasn't spoken? Somebody want to weigh in? Yeah.
I think we need the freedom of hypercapitalism also.
Well, King was a democratic socialist. He did not make a public declaration of that, but it was well known in his close circles. He had been very deeply influenced by Marx. He was very deeply influenced by the social gospel, Walter Rauschenbusch, who was the minister of the church that I belonged to in Rochester, New York, where Frederick Douglass also lived. So Rochester, upstate New York. The Baptist minister, Walter Rauschenbusch, and Frederick Douglass as well, connected the gospel to the well-being of all, to basic needs, to alleviating poverty. Given the debates among Christians today on any number of issues, that's something certainly refreshing, is to see King as an advocate of the poor, not just as a policy decision, but as a central affirmation of what he thought the good news was that Jesus preached and that Paul spread in the Greco-Roman world. So when I teach the New Testament, I think I teach it in the spirit of King, although we haven't had the class that often. But that, I think, is well supported. He was a theological student. He had studied with some of the leading theologians of his time, and he saw the gospel as having a practical demand on his life, and he should be characterized accurately as a democratic socialist. For example, where did Bernie Sanders get the idea from? Bernie Sanders had been involved in the civil rights movement at the University of Chicago, 66, 67, thereabouts. And so this was the language of the time, I can assure you. It's not an un-American or foreign import. It's homegrown, goes back to the social gospel and the Socialist Party, populism of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. Paul Tillich was a socialist. Paul Tillich, who's a big influence on King, was on the #1 on the hit list of Hitler when the Nazis came to power, and he had to flee to the United States and lived in exile. He did radio broadcasts during the war urging the German people to disobey orders of the Nazi regime. So Paul Tillich was a socialist. In fact, in the letter from Birmingham jail and throughout this book, a lot of the references, if you actually track them down politically, are democratic socialists. And I think that is news to people who think that King was a moderate or was, somehow. Well, for example, at the Super Bowl last February, there was a commercial for Dodge trucks that took an excerpt from King's speech, the drum major instinct, to sell cars, sell trucks. Well, that speech, if you look at that speech, which I teach, it's a sermon technically, it's about a deep critique of consumerism and overspending and buying things you don't need, and we would add are not environmentally sustainable. So King was a deep critic of capitalism, and maybe that's a legacy, if we want to get King at least remembered accurately, that should be retrieved.